Every now and again, there's a smartphone that comes along that makes you beg the question, how much do you actually need from your smart device? If the answer is as much as possible, this might be the phone you've been waiting for. This is Pocketnow and I'm Joshua Vergara. What's going on, everybody? Let's take a look at the Vivo NEX 3 here at the launch event in Shanghai. Alright, let's get the obvious out of the way first. This is the waterfall full view display that you're looking at here, where the sides literally spill over and you don't get any physical buttons as a result. Instead, you get this little grill over on the right side, which is where the power button would be if there was one. You can actually hold on that area even when the phone is off because there's some sort of sensor that is sensing for your presses at all times. You then get on-screen prompts for where the volume buttons would be, so you just have to press on the side at those designated areas to turn up and down the volume. It's an interesting concept, but this is all in the name of having as much screen as possible, and I have to admit, it's a pretty damn good looking screen. This is a 6.89-inch Full HD Plus resolution display, an OLED display, so the colors do look pretty awesome. When you're playing videos and whatnot on here, you can expand the media, but then certain elements are literally spilling over. And that might mean that there's some palm projection that has to be added onto here, and so far it seems like it's working pretty well. Even in just the short time that I've been using the phone, I haven't seen any wayward presses happening, and my palm actually hasn't been touching anything that might be in those corners. There are a couple of other functions of this waterfall display. For example, those edges that spill over on the sides can be used for ambient light effects. For example, when you're playing music, it'll just show a visualizer on there so you can have a little bit more fun visually with your music. There's also an in-display fingerprint sensor, which I already set up, and it does work pretty quickly. So even if it's not going to be like that Apex design that they had before, this is definitely one that still works really nicely. I did manage to get one game on there, Data Wing, and as I'm holding the phone in sort of this claw formation here, my fingers at the top and bottom of the display in landscape mode didn't trigger anything, so clearly the palm projection is doing a pretty good job. The jury is still a little bit out in terms of whether or not the full view display makes this phone easier to handle, especially in one hand. This is still a large display, so it feels like a rather large phone, but it's not too bad, at least in my first usage, but we'll have to see what that's like on the daily. And all of those apps and games should be powered really well because what you get underneath that full view display is the Snapdragon 855 Plus. You also get 8 or 12 gigabytes of RAM with 256 gigabytes of onboard storage. All of this is cooled with a vapor cooling chamber that should allow for gaming to go on for long periods of time without the phone actually heating up. Adding to the notion that this phone might have a little bit more than you ultimately need from a smartphone, you do get a 4500 mAh battery on here that can be charged using Vivo's Super Flash charging at 44 watts. And all of that power is in the name of making sure this phone can handle all of the 5G ambitions that Vivo has with the NEX 3. Obviously, we're working with Android on here, Android 9.0, but this version of the UI is called FunTouch 9.1. I can't say too much about the actual usage of this OS. This is one of the first times that I'm actually using FunTouch personally, but also this is a version of the phone that doesn't have the Google Play Store installed. So it's not like I could get a bunch of apps on here that I normally use, much less any games that I wanted to try out. But there are a couple of elements to this UI that seem pretty useful. For example, in the settings, you get a bunch of different ways of catering the experience to your liking. For example, you can have the navigation bar actually there with back, recent, and home, or you can do swipe up gestures. Speaking of swipe up gestures, you can swipe up from the bottom in order to bring up the control center. It's kind of an iPhone-like control center, but that also means that you don't get these same settings in the notification dropdown. Now we can talk about the cameras, and there's a lot to talk about here. You have 4 different cameras, one of which is hidden in a pop-up at the top of the display. It's a little bit wider than what you might expect from Vivo phones, at least up until now, but it does mean that this phone has a bit more of a symmetrical look. That is a 16 megapixel shooter that comes with both portrait modes and beautification settings, and there's a ton of them. I turned them all up to max, and obviously the results looked pretty gnarly. Now we can talk about the cameras on the rear. It's a triple setup in a circular design that looks a little bit like an Iron Man badge. The main sensor is the biggest one, quite literally. Vivo went with Samsung's 64 megapixel ISOCELL sensor that should provide some pretty awesome results. To get the full 64 megapixel photos, you do have to turn on that mode, which is available inside of the camera app. Obviously, picture quality results are going to have to wait for my full review when I get my hands on a review unit. However, there are 2 other lenses that I should mention, including an ultra-wide lens and a telephoto lens, both of which are at 13 megapixels. There are a couple of quirky things about the camera app. One thing I noticed is that when you're in the video mode and you want to turn on the ultra-wide mode, you can turn it on using a little button over on the side, but then the zoom designation on the bottom still stays at 1x. It's a little bit confusing. But that said, you can record video using this, and I look forward to actually vlogging with this phone, hopefully sooner rather than later. And ultimately, this is something I wanted to ask all of you, so get into the comment sections below and tell me what you think about having a 64 megapixel camera. Obviously, things like pixel binning and stabilization are going to benefit from having so many megapixels, and also the sensor is a little bit larger than what you would expect in a smartphone. So there are some benefits here, but I want to know what you all think. So it's a 5G phone, it has a ton of display because of that waterfall design, 44-watt charging, a 4500 milliamp hour battery, a pop-up camera at 16 megapixels, and a 64 megapixel main shooter. That's a lot of stuff to talk about in just one device, and all of this is like turning up the dial to 11. And so that's your first look at the Vivo NEX 3. Let me know what you think about this device in the comment sections down below. Let's have a discussion about this really interesting device, and let me know which of the features you are most excited for. Stay tuned for the full review, and for pricing and availability, I'll probably come back and get into the comment sections once the event is over, because that's where we're going to find out where this is going to go and for how much. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and call it on this one. Thank you so much for watching. Drop some likes on this video and then subscribe to the Pocketnow channel if you haven't already. All right, I'm going to get going on the next 3, and we will see you in our next video.